Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Good afternoon, dear friends. Today we have a plenary session which is devoted to a very relevant topic of competition and data technologies. As part of IFC, we would like to discuss the subject, and this is no wonder, because this is the subject matter which changed the world and is changing it cardinally every day. On the other hand, we're talking about competition, how to make services comfortable, how to make services and products agile. First of all, I would like to introduce my colleagues today with whom we're going to run this session. Vladimir Verkhoshinsky, CEO and First Deputy Chair of the Board of Alpha Bank, Alexander Vidakhin, First Deputy Chair of Sberbank, Ilya Sachkov, General Director of IB Group, and Amit Malik, Global Open Banking and API Lead of Accenture. I welcome all of you here, and my first question is to Alexander Vidakhin. The Bank of Russia quite recently published a report on ecosystems, and we have seen quite an active reaction of the market to that report, because, of course, in terms of ecosystems, we would like, as the regulator, to see it's quite proactive development, and we need to have many of those ecosystems. But also we have a question how to ensure a competition between ecosystems. Sasha, what do you think? Can we build such a market, an economic market, when an ecosystem and competition would complement each other, but rather complement each other than compete and oppose each other? Well, it's a good question, a question which consists of two parts. Whether I believe in it, yes, I do. Whether second part is whether we need to do that. Yes, we need to agree how to do that. And here we have some minor nuances that we need to talk about. First of all, we do support competition and a level playing field for all. I do not fully understand why these rules are planned to capture only banks, but not our partners who are non-banks. Evidently, this regulation, are still planned to be covered, but we have a unique situation in this country. And Amit probably would provide some comments on that. We are the only country where ecosystems kind of like emerged on the basis of banks, because banks were the most tech-savvy. Thanks to the effort of the regulator and the bankers themselves, this is a competitive advantage, of course, but this is also kind of like a risk. When you're saying that regulation should be universal for all market players, but we do see that banks were the first to go into ecosystems. And I would appreciate some comments from Vladimir, how banks are going to behave themselves there. But how do we support competition in ecosystems? Because one or two ecosystems would not be about competition. What other banks have to do? They need to compete. But how? How openly, I would think. I think that one of the conditions of open and fair competition would be open and fair rules for all. And we actually urge you to have such universal rules. That's actually the approach which was pursued by the Bank of Russia. The regulatory requirements would be universal and uniform for all the participants in the financial market, yes. But the tech companies that would like to enter this market also need to comply with such requirements. But we only see that in relation to the banks that they are acquiring or will acquire. But those are small financial institutions, so regulation is also quite limited and depends on the size. I would like to add here as well that, well, we discussed this also during the macroprudential regulation session and panel, and it was quite pro-cyclical. That formula of regulation really contains many things that do not really refer to ecosystems. For example, a DPC we're building, this is fixed assets. This is more or less credited towards your capital. I mean, based on the formula, you have quite high ratios there. Oversight, troubled assets. Again, regulation is against or counter-cyclical, as it is suggested, against the bad assets. But they are also taken into account with some factor put on them. So there are many issues there that need to be discussed, and these are the questions that, of course, need and will be discussed. But at a macro level, of course, we should be thinking about kind of like the uniform competition environment for all, and including the foreign players. Our position is not to have any privileges. However, the question of how to do that, this is probably the most important and acute one. Vladimir, do you think that competition is still possible when you have ecosystems and some players who are beyond the ecosystems, and it is difficult for them to compete with the ecosystems? In terms of regulation, do you think we need really to have such regulation, or just leave it as it is and the market will more or less handle it by itself? Well, to us, to grow and to compete, the situation is okay with us. Alpha Bank has been one of the fastest growing institutions of late, and of course Alpha Bank can compete in such an environment. However, we should say that once every 5 years, there would be a hype concept that is to the liking of many, then everybody is going on board with that concept, and then sometimes that concept dies away. And some time ago, we all started calling ourselves ecosystems, and that was a very catchy word. The recent St. Petersburg International Economic Forum demonstrated that the business community started somehow to really stop calling us an ecosystem, and didn't want really to mention the name of an ecosystem. And for example, in my neighborhood, there's a network of barbershops, and on the billboard, they are claiming to be an ecosystem of barbershops. So major players really spent a lot of time arguing about words, whether it is an ecosystem or not. So the correct name would be some mobile applications, a chain of those applications that might put the whole chain together. It's one of the models for the future. 5 years ago, people thought that only ecosystems would survive, but now ECG says that only 10 or maybe 15% of the ecosystems would survive, and 80% of the ecosystems would die. Well, super happy, and more or less is the view of the client. You have a mobile application, and in that domain, you have a multitude of services which are comfortable and understandable by you. You are using those services every day. But there are various resources. Big ecosystems have more capacity to do something at a discount. Small companies don't have such capacity. Strong players, of course, will survive. Even if you would take a look at that from the point of view of big companies, the small and medium-sized, would they survive? Well, I don't think so. And Mikhail Zadornov was talking about that yesterday. So this is not only about banking, but our finance. And globally, we do see some scaling up and integration of players. And several big players would be taking more and more shares of the business to themselves. And this is a trend which is seen everywhere, including in Russia. 10 years ago, in the retail business, we had totally different names. The top 10 of banks today are totally different from what we had in retail banking 10 years ago. 10 years ago, the top 10 players had 50% of the retail banking in the country, and now they have a share of 80%. I think that 5 or 7 players quite soon will take a share of 90% of the market of banking, and they would be competing between themselves. They would be big enough to afford investment in technologies, into marketing, into research, and small and medium-sized players don't have a chance there. But how do you kind of get to that point of having 5 to 7 players? Because there is a risk that there will be only 1 or 2 surviving. Well, if you take mathematics, then usually the first play is bigger than the second one, and the second one is bigger than the third one. It doesn't matter what we are talking about, but it's the fact of mathematics and life. And now, we need to really take another view of this from the point of view of a client. When a client invests 100 rubles into the bank, then that client would really be risking only 10% of its money. The rest of the risk would be assumed by the bank and or by other market players. We need to ensure the stable operation of the bank. Or take a monopolies. If you have some oligopolistic or monopolistic positions, these are something to really watch and monitor. And the question of ecosystems or super apps is something to discuss. And I agree with the Bank of Russia that there must be regulation, but I do agree with Alexander that we need to discuss what that regulation is going to be. Alpha Bank is probably less hit by that. Alpha Bank, as we said, that we are not going into super apps, but we have a concept of a financial super service, something that we can do better, finance and something around finance. This is what we know how to do. Now that people are trying to get information as fast as possible and to exchange such information, such client approach is very important. So a financial super service in Alpha Bank is something that we are going to compete with and use in our competition with the super apps. And so meaning that more or less you exclude any partnership with the other financial players. So you think that because of your super financial services and great client management, you would be able to take a niche in the market. Well, quite the opposite. An ecosystem is actually sucking everything inside itself. So any non-core services, and it is owned by the ecosystem. But we are building a financial super service, and we need to provide our clients with other services. And since we don't have those, we actually enter into partnerships. Our response to the systemic players is partnership. So Sberbank has its own content and streaming media and business, etc. And this is good and bad at the same time, because good is that's what they can do whatever they like with that, but bad is that they are focused on that. But we can provide our client a financial super service and a content super service, etc., etc. So it's a different view of the same picture, I would say. Yes, you are not investing into your own assets. You don't own those assets. You are building a new ecosystem. Well, nobody owns anybody, and partnerships, they can be signed on, or they can be dismantled. It's an open and a closed system, if you like. Olga is saying that you are also subject to that regulation. Well, I mean, no. If we don't own anything, if you follow the recommendations for regulation word by word, I think we would come to a point when the conditions would be totally equal. My question is to Amit, actually. we do have the Russian view of this situation, and we understand the peculiarities of the Russian financial market. But Amit, based on your experience, because you are with Accenture, and how do you see the situation in Europe and in the US, this ecosystem and the competition between ecosystems? And my second question is about how financial players in Europe in the European competition context are trying to build their strategies and to win, or at least not to lag too much behind from the leading tech companies.
Thank you. So I think a lot of it goes back into what is the motivation for introducing open banking in a given country or a jurisdiction. Some regulators go in for using open banking to increase competition, like what has happened in UK and Europe, which I believe is the case for Russia. Some regulators go in for increased innovation. Some regulators go for financial inclusion. This is the case for open banking in developing economies like Mexico or Brazil. And there are some regulators who go in for fair data exchange, which is the case for open banking in places like Australia. So I think if you start looking at the motivation, then that gives you an idea of what is the end game for open banking. What we have seen in Europe is something very, very interesting. That there are certain things which the European regulator and both the UK regulator have done really well to increase the level of competition within the ecosystem. So for example, not only have they set standards, but they have also introduced industry infrastructure. So for example, things like an open banking directory, things like a dispute management system, things like open banking, third-party accreditation process, etc. So my view is that we can introduce a level of regulation and control into the ecosystem. And this will introduce fairness also, because this will control who has access to the banking data and who cannot. So for example, in Europe, we see that there is still a very, very reasonably stringent process for third parties to get accredited and get a license for accessing the banking ecosystem. So I think that will address some of the challenges which our colleagues here in the panel highlighted, that ecosystem players shouldn't get free access to banking data. And that is what we are seeing. But bear in mind the other factor, that the entire end game here is for open data exchange across banking or financial and non-financial industries. There has to be a starting point. In most areas, banks, because they are technologically advanced, they are more digital in the nature of their businesses, have been chosen as the starting point. Open banking clearly is evolving into open finance and into open data, which is really a cross-industry view of open banking. So if you think of UK, we started open banking in 2017 and 2018. Open banking is now moving on to open finance, where other parts and all parts of financial industry are getting included. But there is clear movement away into other industries. So for example, the latest regulation which is going to get passed in UK is open data. And I think once more and more industries open up, we have open telecoms, open retail, open manufacturing, open utilities, open travel, we will have this ecosystem which we're talking about, where there'll be fair exchange of data and everybody can participate in a competitive and innovative manner.
Спасибо, Amit. Кстати, хорошую вы тему затронули.
Thank you, Amit. I think you touched upon a very interesting subject. API, open banking, open finance, indeed. There's a different experience in Europe and in the UK in terms of open banking and open finance. But maybe I should ask a question to my colleagues. Since the Russian market is only starting to discuss whether we need to come up with an open API and what needs to be mandatory or what should be a recommendation, then banks say that you as the regulator can establish this mandatory API and our data would be open to tech companies and they will be making money on our data. But what we are going to have in return? So, Sasha, in terms of open banking and open finance, I think this is good for the client because then you more or less handle your data in the way that you would like. The client can can decide what to do with the banking, with the data. But how do you also preserve regulation? Because in terms of API, this is the same question. If we are introducing some recommended or mandatory API, how do we provide different players, not only tech companies, but also the financial sector, to be closer to the client and more efficient in terms of its business model? Well, so many questions indeed. Let me start with the following. We, in Sber, are very supportive of API. We think that we need to have very good and strong competition, and here I agree totally with Vladimir. And I am happy that in the market today we have many players who are pushing each other forward, and we are watching what Alpha is doing, or Tinkoff, or VTB. So all our partners and members of our club, and they are probably watching us as well. And this is good because the client would benefit in the end of the day from that. Open banking and open API are things that are indeed needed, because then the client would have a super application there in the mobile phone and a full replica of the wallet. Because, I mean, in your world, you have several cards of different banks, and every card and every bank would be fighting to have a higher share. But when you have the super application in your mobile phone, hopefully it would be the same as you have from Sberbank or Alpha Bank, then it would be good. And then there would be a fight between mobile apps to win the client, to make it most comfortable. I have an idea. Does it at all make sense from the point of view of a client? We are also clients. We not only work in our jobs, but we are also clients. Does it make any sense to have a universal application, which is not really linked to a particular bank? I don't think that you can find an answer to that because like a super mega super duper application. I mean, something that we never had. Nobody actually was able to come up with such a super duper application to cover all. You have all kinds and different applications there that probably meet different demands, and then they can be put into this one overarching super app, if you like. But then fintech would come as soon as you have a super application to come up with different ideas and provide more applications. It would be good to actually invite fintech to the banking sector, and that's when open banking becomes accessible to all. And we are in for competition, and all competition should be focused on the client and to the benefit of the client. Now, the second question was about data. This is quite a complicated issue, and not only in terms of getting any competitive advantages. I think that here we need to be very clear about the need of a uniform regulation for all banks, non-banks, any place in terms of this super app. But we need to find a balance. We have a negative example of Europe, negative in terms of the development of that sector. PSD2 actually authorized everything, but GPR actually closed everything. So everything is fine, you can do anything, but in reality you cannot do anything. Well, AI, no artificial intelligence, applications are being introduced. So 3 years later, the European regulator is trying to really provide an incentive to fintech and startups to catch up with the US, where regulation is much easier. But there's another example of China, which is on the other end of this scale. But we need to find a balance as part of this public concord, and it's important to have the client to be able to look at all the agreements and consents that a client actually gave and see them in one place.
I don't think anyone from the panel remembers anything. Well, yes, as I said, no one recalls anything. Again, what do we do with the permission? That's an important topic, but let's change gears. Let's switch gears. All the banks now use the digital profile, the so-called digital profile for data. And that project was very successful, and we did the special directory where you can change, modify your permission. But maybe we, together with the market, will sit down and think of this registry of commercial permission. I mean, no one can remember that. Does it make sense to you, Vladimir? That's just an idea I got right now. So I'm just using this discussion as a brainstorming session to maybe come up with new regulatory requirements. Not just that, but new infrastructure that would spur further competition. Okay, why don't we set up a consortium, an infrastructure solution, when a person would have the chance to keep that register and then decide who to give this permission to. If we talk about APIs, people need to be aware of the list of permission. The data, it's not the data of the company, regardless of whether it's operator or a bank. These are my data. I want to be able to control them. Well, I don't believe there is demand for it. I wouldn't overdo it. You know, maybe 95% of our people don't really need to know who they give permission to. But maybe we'll reach that stage in a couple of years. If we are to go towards open banking, open API, yes, definitely. Data management rules need to be part of it to avoid any fraud. There are old school people or, conventional concepts like bank and money, and there are less familiar things like data, information. And very often you tend to regulate what you understand, like money and banks. But sometimes e-commerce, big tech, have vast areas of data. But old school people, conventional, people from the street wouldn't know what it's all about. And, the banks would be forced to provide their APIs, while the data part would remain unregulated. So we need to have this permission engine, permission management engine. So why can't we have open API for non-banks? Well, it has to apply to everyone. We'll be there in 10 years. I mean, why don't we push telecoms or e-commerce to use APIs? Yes, given the permission of the customer. Why don't we push the search engines to open APIs? Well, that's called regulatory arbitrage or tech arbitrage. It's just not many people are aware of this. So just like with open banking, there needs to be open everything. Well, there's a new concept, and I've been following some international headlines. Everyone realizes that open banking, this is something that belongs to the past already. So open data, that's a new concept, regardless of who's the source of the data is. Well, I would argue with you, thinking about it in the next 2 or 3 years, that will be too late. Talking of API and permission management, I think we are actually lagging behind. On the one hand, our financial market is super tech, and we've, as a regulator, have contributed to that. But again, it's not just the financial market participants that are on the radar, but it's also the business community and the consumers. And we understand that there are barriers, that there is the security perimeter that the big tech sets up. But, there are so many issues that we need to address before the deadline that you put, before those 2 or 3 years expire. So I've got a question to Mr. Tachkov. Well, data is the most sensitive area, sensitive to each of us as citizens of Russia. Now, what would you say about the experience of the US and the UK? What was successful, what was not? And as Alexander said, we should not repeat someone else's mistakes. We should learn from them. And again, security is in the cornerstone. How do we move forward? European banks and the European Commission initially didn't really think it was all about security. The GDPR story seemed quite logical and natural. Just ban everything. Well, maximize responsibility for any leaks. And that seems natural to everyone. In Russia, no one is afraid. No one carries responsibility for leaking the data, our data. And they're often leaked beyond the perimeter of financial institutions. So that seemed to be the proper approach, but that prompted an unexpected response. And very often, criminals get access to this data, and then they blackmail institutions. So that, they say, you either give us the money, you either give us the ransom, or we share this story, we tell about it to the Euro Commission. And the ransom is just half of the penalty that was supposed to be paid to the European Commission. So they didn't think about it, and they got another problem. But what's good for Russia? We are learning from this experience. We can find some balance, because we still haven't tackled crime too. So we shouldn't move from one extreme point to another. Okay, 3 points. Give us the 3 points. What do we need to do as a country in terms of data? Well, again, I'm talking. I will now put my hat as a security man. We need big fines for the financial institution that allowed that leak, criminal responsibility for the person who was an accomplice, because there are insiders in those financial institutions and they sell these data, or sometimes inadvertently allow these leaks to happen. So they carry responsibility and they need to pay for it. I mean, you need to pay a price for it. And you also need to work with law enforcement. It's always like, investigation is like a military operation. So financial responsibility, number one. Number two, criminal responsibility, definitely. And third, we need a state program of zero tolerance to cybercrimes. Unfortunately, and particularly in the banking sector, they felt the pinch since 2011. This issue has not been addressed. But if we ramp up the fines and criminal responsibility, but if we don't increase punishment, we'll follow in the footsteps of Europe. So financial responsibility, criminal responsibility, and zero tolerance. Just strengthening 100 times focus on cybercrime. So what about this registry of permission, registry of consents for financial operations? Does it make sense? I agree with Vladimir. Most of our people don't really need it. Most of the folks out there don't need it. I don't know why you need it. So you don't really need to know who you gave permission to. Well, I just need to know if there's any leak. There's the dark net where data are sold and bought. Well, it's fine if companies have the legal right to keep the data, but there's a different problem when you have bots on Telegram that sell data. Well, you cannot address these issues with just one solution. Definitely not. Well, sometimes you can actually check whether you gave permission or not. Well, yes, you can do it. Okay, we're now getting some questions from the audience. Will we have foreign ecosystems here in Russia? Will they push or crowd out Russian ones? As Alexander said, we should have a level playing field for ecosystems, regardless of whether they're Russian or foreign. So do you think foreign systems will come to Russia that have the potential to oust Russian ecosystems? I wouldn't raise this question in the future. They're already here. We just have restrictions. Facebook, Google, we don't have Amazon due to certain reasons. But we've got Netflix and some Chinese ecosystems. Well, they're making their steps in a very cautious way. Our regulation is built in a way to make sure that a lot is allowed only to Russian firms.